Hello, welcome everybody. Thank you for joining me. This is a bonus episode. So this is going to be for two sets of people. So the first set is for those who subscribe to podcasting and platforms in the premium tier. And the second is for people who subscribe to the We Are Libertarians Patreon 25 and above. So and essentially what I want to do with this is just kind of document what I'm doing in podcasting every week and sit down. And I'm in my cozy chair in my office. So in my office, I have 6 bookshelves that kind of line two of the walls. And then I have book carts in front of those. And then the other wall, kind of in front of those, I have two desks, an L-shaped desk, and one is for podcasting with my lights and my board, and then the other is for work, and it's a standing desk, and I've got my treadmill under there, and then I've got a cozy chair in here with tables and bookshelves around it. So this room is jam-packed, cluttered. It's the main hangout for two of my cats. And next to my comfy chair, I set up a microphone. So I have used this microphone. I don't think I've ever used it before, actually. And what is it? It's an Audio-Technica AT2040. So the main one that I normally use in my Rode Podcaster Pro is an AT4033A. And so I'm sitting here in my comfy chair, which is very, very, it's like a lazy boy, but not as big. And I set up a microphone so I can sit here and do podcast in comfort. Audio only. I am shirtless. Probably shouldn't. You people are paying money for this. I should not talk about that. But I enjoy kind of having monologues and sitting and talking, and I want to do more of it. And I think there's something to being physically relaxed that gives me the ability to have more of a relaxed conversation, almost like I'm conversing with you, as opposed to when I'm sitting over there 2 feet away from me in my business chair under the lights with my condenser microphone plugged in. It just gives you a bit of a different mood because I don't know, my muscle memory when I'm sitting in that chair in my traditional podcast setup that I've done forever is very, it's like a reflex. It's welcome to Weird Libertarians. Thanks so much for joining me. Hey, appreciate it, everybody. Welcome to the official show. And I've tried kind of sitting in the back porch and sitting in the backyard and just having conversations, and I really enjoy it. So I set this up so I can do kind of more monologue-y stuff that feels a little more conversational on the Chris Spangle Show and for patrons and everything. So now I've got a lot of podcasts, and I podcast by day and podcast by night, and I don't have any clue who's going to listen to any of this because I think on the podcasting and platforms I have 16 comps for people, but I don't think those people actually engage on the paid thing. And then I know I have wonderful patrons over on the We Are Libertarian side, 25 and over, who are very dedicated, $100 a month, very dedicated, and I'm sure you guys will listen. But what I want to do for my podcasting and platforms is kind of take people behind the scenes and explain what I do on a weekly basis and what I'm trying out and what I'm struggling with and what I'm using. Because I think the exercise of doing that is going to make me think about the curriculum that I'm writing and the podcast about podcasting. I just sort of, I also think it might help me organize my thoughts a little bit. And I think in the talking out loud part of that, I think that if you're interested in podcasting and how to do podcasting, you may hear some things that you want to try. But this is going to evolve over time and change, I'm sure, like everything else. But I think maybe I should start with me, for those of you who have joined For those of you who are in the We Are Libertarians Patreon, you know me for a long time. You've listened to a lot of episodes. You know some of this stuff. And I think you kind of deserve to hear where I'm at in my podcasting career. Like, do I really care about doing my show anymore? Which the answer is deeply, deeply yes. Even though it may have not seemed like that the last couple years. And I'll get to all that at some point. And then, for those of you new to the podcasting and platform side, you signed up for this because you follow one of my podcasts, the Pat Down, the Chris Spangle Show, Bob and Tom. That's not my podcast, but that's the one that I do professionally, history of modern politics, all that stuff. So I want to start in this first one just to kind of set the table in case you don't know who I am or what I'm doing. So everything that kind of comes after makes sense. Okay. So a little bit about my history. I grew up playing with my talk boy from Home Alone 2 and doing my own little radio shows in my talk boy. And I love that thing. And I don't know when I threw it away or my mom threw it away, but I want to buy one on eBay at some point, just so I can have it for the back bookshelf. It was a very meaningful thing to me, having that talk boy and kind of recording my own little talk radio shows. I think where the desire to become a talk radio show host and getting involved in politics came from was my grandmother on my dad's side, who I called Mosh. And Mosh was very, very into Rush Limbaugh. I spent a tremendous amount of time with her. She really helped raise me. And we would get in her little Mazda R6 and drive to O'Malley's grocery store, and she would buy me orange slices, and she'd listen to Rush and rant and talk about the Democrats and say right on Rush. And I think that combined with the Bob and Tom show, which I would go to work with my dad, which was one of my favorite things. And he'd always have Bob and Tom tapes, and we'd listen to it. And on the trip to Florida, we'd listen to Bob and Tom tapes. And so I would listen to Bob and Tom on my way to school, which is a talk radio show that I work for now. That is an ensemble cast of people just kind of busting balls and having fun every day. And I think those two experiences were very formative as a kid to make me kind of want to go into radio. But the definitive moment really happened I must have been 7, 8, 9 years old, sitting on the front lawn, listening to the radio, which I have, if you look on the back bookshelf behind me on my podcasting stuff, you'll see a little black radio kind of over on my left shoulder. That is the radio that I used to tape to my bicycle. I could never get my parents to buy me a bike radio, which I thought was the coolest thing ever. But this thing went with me everywhere as a kid, and I listened to the radio all the time. Talk radio, NPR, Q95, Bob and Tom. And I remember sitting on the front lawn with my headphones in, listening to that little radio. It could have been my Walkman. Doesn't make a difference, but, never let the facts get in the way of a good story. So it was that little black radio that I display in the background. And I was listening to War of the Worlds by H.G. Wells' story, but it was done in a radio play by, who's that Citizen Kane guy? Orson Welles. And if you don't know this story, he does this kind of milquetoast broadcast, and there's music, beautiful music playing, and he interrupts with a breaking news. There have been aliens that have landed in New Jersey, and does it as if on the radio aliens are invading New Jersey. Now, anybody who knew the story knew that that's kind of what was going on, but it was done so convincingly that 75 years later, sitting on that front lawn, listening to that, I had goosebumps and I bought it. I was mesmerized with it. And I don't think that the thought was as articulated as I can articulate it now, but the feeling was just like any medium that can make me feel the way that radio makes me feel, I want to be a part of. And I want to do that. And so my life's goal was to have my own talk radio show or to work in radio. Fast forward to high school, get involved in the AV club, learning audio editing, learning video editing. Podcasting did not exist. It was the late 90s, early 2000s. But 9/11 really impacted me in a big way. And I became much more serious about politics, became college Republicans chair in 2004, became a libertarian through a campaign in 2004 through Andy Horning. I was working as a pizza delivery guy. I was working at a garden center. I was working for my dad doing construction cleanup. And I constantly had the radio in my ears. I was listening to Christian radio. I was listening to comedy tapes. I was listening to Bob and Tom tapes. I was ripping, eventually, Howard Stern's satellite shows, Bubba the Love Sponge radio show, Don and Mike, and listening to them. Eventually, Don and Mike would go on and start a podcast, which was incredibly influential. Glenn Beck and Rush Limbaugh, Glenn Beck especially, because when I started at the radio station 0405 as a board op, I would listen to Glenn Beck. He had just started in radio, and he was from the beginning a storyteller, and he does radio in a way that is different than any other syndicated radio show host, which sort of just kind of maximizes what they make and doesn't spend it on their organization. I'm fortunate that I work for Tom, who has, the mindset of like, I'm going to own my thing and fund my operation and manage my product, much like Glenn Beck, who builds probably too much and I think almost went bankrupt or did. But Glenn kind of just was like Orson Welles, and that was his hero, and always was doing storytelling, and I really, really enjoyed listening to him. And, I just think from high school and college years to I kind of dropped out of college. I mean, I didn't have a professional job until I was 28-ish. I mean, look, my ability to listen to podcasts is almost non-existent at this point. I may get 30 minutes of listening in a day. Last year, my goal was to read a lot of books, and I used audiobooks to kind of help speed the process up. So I barely listened to any podcasts last year. But, when podcasting came around in 2005, I was an immediate adopter on my iPod. I was just hugely into podcasting from the beginning, working at a radio station in 2007. Pitched the idea of a podcast. Andrew Lee, rest in peace, turned me down. But then when he left, we started a podcast. That's where my podcasting career started. But I was part-time. So I just think like ingesting all of these old-time radio play tapes that I would get from the library while I'm delivering pizzas, or Garrison Keillor while delivering pizzas, or audiobooks, or radio through the afternoon listening to talk radio, political talk radio while I'm doing construction cleanup, or listening to Howard Stern and Bubba the Love Sponge and Mike O'Mara while doing, menial jobs for hours and hours and hours on end. It just ingested and ingrained in me a lifelong love of talk radio, of doing what I do at the Pat Down, of what I do at Bob and Tom, what I do in podcasting. And I am now almost 40. I'm 39 and a half. I am doing things. I do video and audio editing all day. I get to build media brands. And I think if I could go back and say to my 18-year-old self, who was very depressed and very sad, that you will one day get to live your dreams, where you will get to host your own radio shows through the Chris Spangle Show and others, through doing the Pat Down and, working for Bob and Tom, your childhood heroes, and not being disappointed by them. I've been there for 10 years and learned more than I could ever. I couldn't have paid for the education I got working at Bob and Tom. I don't know. I guess just kind of sitting here talking about this, and feeling somewhat emotional about it. Getting to work I worked at the Motor Speedway as an audio editor. I don't know. Audio has fulfilled every dream that I've had, now, I had to work, right. And be smart about it and get involved. But, I don't know. I just love this format because me sitting here in my chair can transport to you in your ears, and you can hear me talking about myself and my career, and you're mildly entertained. And it could be 5 years from now when you're listening to this, and you maybe have the emotion of man, you know what? I'm doing something now in my career that I really wanted to do when I was a kid, and I really connect with that. Or the emotion of whatever happened to my dreams, you know? And I'm sitting here kind of having a moment thinking like, I do all these different shows and I do all these different podcasts. Which one of these is fulfilling that like lifelong mission that I've had, right? I just ripped off about 5 episodes of one of my podcasts, and I'm doing it because it's a service to, so it's Liberty Explained, and Liberty Explained is kind of trickled out, and I've decided that I'm going to do it solo. I've not told my co-host yet, which I'm kind of nervous about. And I had like all these episodes written out, and I just recorded them solo, and I think I agree with most of what I said, but I wrote most of these episodes like a year and a half ago. And I guess I've kind of evolved, like in one of them that I don't think I'm going to air, like I talk about like a very Thomas Paine idea of every generation ought to reset its laws and vote. So millennials should not live under boomer laws. They should get to rewrite their own laws. And I guess that makes sense, and that is very libertarian, but I don't know if I believe that anymore. I have become a little bit more of a conservative and more towards the Edmund Burke side of like, it's important if you see a fence, you don't just tear down the fence. The fence was there for a reason. But I kind of recorded that show and I'm going to put it out because it gets good downloads. It good marketing for the podcast network, and it drives more people to the podcast that I love a little bit more. So I don't know. There's shows like that I kind of do where my heart and soul's not into it, and like, should I really be doing it? But there's like kind of monetary stuff attached to it, right? So I don't know. Is that fulfilling that kind of childhood dream of like connecting with listeners in a way that I want to connect with, kind of like I'm doing here? So start podcasting in 2007 at WXNT. Go to the Libertarian Party of Indiana. Start there. Or I take up the mantle from Mike Cole doing their podcast there. Spent in 2010, I believe it was. I got a letter from Wells Fargo saying if you'd like to take out a loan against your car, you're approved up to $1,500. And I was very poor. I was thinking the other day how, when I worked in radio, I was making $250 a week. I was spending $120 of that on gas, getting to and from work. I had a transmission blow up, and I remember weeping because I had no idea what I was going to do. I got a car loan, fortunately. But I was so broke that I had to start looking. I had to leave radio to go look for another job, and ended up getting a little bit of a pay increase to go work for the Libertarian Party, which I had some interest in third parties and libertarianism. But in 2010, I got this loan, and I spent like $800 of it on podcasting equipment at Guitar Center. And it was an Alesis Multimix 8 and some Shure SM48s and some really cheap cables and a couple nice cables. And then started the Libertarian Party of Indiana podcast, and then started doing We Are Libertarians, which now has over 5 million downloads and has been going for a decade, and is how I met my wife, and is the bulk of kind of my podcasting effort over the last decade, which has really been my training ground. So left the Libertarian Party, went to work for an ad agency. Through there, I met the Bob and Tom folks and got hired on there in 2013. And my main job there is kind of managing all of the digital properties podcasts. We get 1 million downloads a month in podcasts. Video views, I think it's 1 million views a month. Maybe wrong about that. Managing, our subscription service and live streaming and social media postings and advertisers and all that stuff. And I've done that day in, day out for years. It's grown in complexity. I manage a staff of 4 people. And it's given me an enormous education. And all the while, I have been doing podcasting on the side with We Are Libertarians and experimenting. And over the last 3 years, I always just did We Are Libertarians once a week, maybe twice a week at certain points, and didn't do other shows. And then I kind of was like, I want to stretch a little bit and do some other stuff. I got invited to do the Pat Down with Miss Pat, which has been huge. A few million downloads on that podcast, peaked in the charts at 8. So I love doing that. It's a huge fan base, and it's a fan base that I would not have attracted had I stayed just in the libertarian wheelhouse. And I love all my black friends and all my new liberal friends, and enjoy talking with them and arguing with them about many different things. And I don't know, I have kind of come out of my shell over the last couple of years. I was always very worried about getting in trouble at work doing podcasting. I was always kind of worried about upsetting the audience. I was always worried about a million different things that kind of stifled my creativity. And kind of getting over that, I have come out of my shell and wanted to try different things like History of Modern Politics, which was, has been a years-long research project for Matt Whitliff and I at this point, which is us reading a bunch of books and then talking about the development of, liberal democratic capitalism in the West. And then there's podcasting and platforms, which I just get asked so often podcasting questions that I started that to kind of say, if you can't afford my consulting services, go listen here. Both of those have kind of, and Liberty Explained, which was sort of started as a way to just kind of explain libertarianism in short bites. I was really convinced by the audience. I was doing 2-hour shows and they wanted to share chunks of this stuff with their friends, and it needed to be shorter. And I was very, long-winded and wanted to do short chunks and trying to experiment kind of with TikTok style stuff. That's where Liberty Explained came from. Same with PNP. HMP was kind of the research project. Pat Down's my comedy project. I want to do at some point a biblical show. I'd love to do maybe the history of Jesus, or the a Bible study on. I'm thinking the Sermon on the Mount, and also history on Indiana, the history of Indiana, a podcast on Indiana history. And I also want to do a history of St. Augustine, Florida. Those are the ones that I constantly want to start. I've actually got, artwork for a history show on how to make history, and I've got artwork for the Indiana history stuff. And I want to start an Indiana history podcast network. And I've got artwork for that too. And the reason being is I just love these things. And so starting podcasts about them allow me to kind of have a reason to learn. So I'm writing a research show right now on the protocols of the Elders of Zion. And I've got 20 tabs open that I was working on this evening and kind of reading through all these different things about, this conspiracy. And I'm going to put it into the Chris Spangle show. But I'm just really interested in that topic. So it gives me a reason to kind of do a systematic study on it. I don't study my Bible enough. And doing a Bible study podcast will kind of force me to have some accountability, right? Liberty Explained is but see, the problem is you get too many projects and there's too many subjects to study with. So that's kind of what I'm struggling with right now is I love being a libertarian. I have no interest in the libertarian movement anymore. And that was a lot of the show. So it's kind of hard to recruit new people. If you're not going, the We Are Libertarian show was always kind of an ensemble of people, and I was always going to events and always kind of recruiting new hosts. And I haven't done that in a while, so I don't really have new hosts, right? So I have kind of had to pivot to make sure that I have my content out. So I'm doing more interviews. I'm doing more monologues. We're doing the ensemble show, but, I'm not going to events because I'm home studying for podcasts a lot. So, and with my family. So I don't know. I think I'm all over the place here. But, I think what's happened to me over the last couple of years is that confidence change. And, the way that I did We Are Libertarians once or twice a week was always just to sit down and hang out with my friends and chit chat. It was especially kind of after my divorce. It was especially after my divorce. So I was putting a lot of effort into dating and keeping my job. And I had smart friends, and I'd go to stuff and I'd recruit people to be on the show. But, as I've kind of become more personally isolated, I've become more bookish. And I've wanted to try other things than, I know I can just sit down and do a talk. I don't mean to be arrogant, but after thousands of hours of hosting podcasts, I get something like 3,000. I can sit down and have a conversation. I don't need to prepare for an interview. I always prepare for an interview. But if I know the guest or my co-host are kind of fun to talk to, we can make a show. And I'm literate enough in a lot of the topics that we talk about on current events to kind of get by and fake it, right? But I don't want to do that anymore. I kind of did that until 2017, 2018, and started to see the way that people counted on me and started to take that more seriously. So I started reading more and researching more and putting more effort into it. Now, the problem that I have now that I wish I did, I had stupid confidence. Stupid people just have confidence. But then when you actually aren't stupid anymore and you think about what you're going to say, you start to overthink about what you're going to say. So this stupid episode on the protocols of the elders of Zion has been bubbling in my mind for 2 months, 3 months, and I haven't been able to force myself to sit down and do it. So it's kind of stupid because I'm doing more research shows and then I'm not following through on the writing of the research shows because it's a little bit of self-sabotagey. But anyways, you're not my therapist. So anyways, to circle back, where I'm kind of at in my podcasting career is taking a much more serious approach to all of this. Instead of just, that's why I think I'm going to kind of enjoy doing this, is sitting down and kind of having a loose conversation. I'm not doing notes. I'm just talking to you. I'm not even going to edit this. Except for when I edited that out. Maybe, if I can't reach the marker button. But, we don't prepare for the pat down. So let's talk about preparation. Okay. For the pat down, we don't talk about what we're going to talk about. We sit down, we turn on the mics, we talk. It's two comedians who have done comedy for 20 years. A podcaster, radio guy who's done that for 20 years. We don't need to prepare. We can have an interesting, fun conversation. For History of Modern Politics, Matt does the notes. Matt is the GOAT of that show, the MVP. He is currently writing notes as we speak. I see it in the Google Docs. And basically writes out the script that we read. And then my role is to read books about what he's writing so I can fill in the gaps, double check him, add things where I can, and then to do all the technical stuff. But the History of Modern Politics is simply so Matt and I can get an education about the development of politics today and the intellectual underpinnings. And it's been incredibly rewarding for me to learn, ancient Roman history and British history and reading books about the development of Western thought and liberalism and autocracy and capitalism and democracy and like these big heady ideas and theoretical politics, I'll call it, that I never really had to learn when I was in retail politics. Because when you work in the party, you're working on Dale Carnegie skills. You're not thinking about, is an anarcho-autocracy better than a liberal democratic capitalistic system like we have, or a constitutional republic better than an anarcho-capitalistic. So I never really did that stuff along the way with Weird Libertarians, and HMP has kind of given me that opportunity. And then, for the Chris Spangle show, we're still doing current events. I do some interviews with young voices to make sure that I've got content to kind of fill in the gaps for the panel show. So on the Chris Spangle show, I've got the panel show, which is the historical remnants of We Are Libertarians, which is a group of friends sitting around talking about politics. If I could do that 5 days a week, I absolutely would. Because I think if I had a dedicated group of 3 or 4 people that could do that every day, we'd be monster. But it's just, you can't ask people to make that commitment. I make a little bit of money off of what the Patreon funds the network, and it funds all the services I have to pay for. And then I make a little bit of money on the ad revenue, but I make an okay, a couple $200-300 off of Weird Libertarians as a whole. But it's an expensive enterprise to run a podcast network and do things for people and have services and kind of have all these websites and have all this infrastructure. And, we'll have the podcast. I will always do the Chris Spangle show. I will never not do that podcast. I just can't not talk about politics, talk about current events. I can't not talk about culture. It will always be something that I do. But, the broader network with hosting shows for other podcasters and all that stuff is totally determinant on whether or not we have enough money to cover the bills. Right. So, and Brian Nichols and I talked about kind of getting together and talking about the network and where do we want that to go. And I'll kind of talk a little bit about that at some point in the future. Because we're sort of at a point where Brian and I are the ones driving the numbers on the network, and everybody else kind of adds some numbers to the thing. But really, it's Brian and I. I make up 3/4 of the downloads for We Are Libertarians podcast network. Brian makes up basically the other quarter, and then there's everybody else. And I don't mean to besmirch my friends who are on the network, but Rimzo has stopped, Hody's stopped, Trisha has stopped. So we're kind of at a point where we need to figure out, do we keep the network going? Do we add more people to the network, which is what I think I'm going to do. Reached out to 2 people today about doing some podcasts. I'm not going to mention that, but, one would be about the great books of liberty. Another would be kind of a storytelling podcast about liberty. Or do you just close it down and kind of go your separate ways and cut as many costs as possible? Liberty Explained, like I said, is kind of going to be like a TikTok-y type thing that I'm doing and experimenting with how to, doing my own TikTok short type material. I'm going to continue to kind of play with that a little bit. And then within the Chris Spangle show, you've got the panel, and then you've got the interviews with various folks. I really have a good relationship with Young Voices, with a lot of young, smart columnists that bring a lot of issues that I would never have thought to talk about, like the water table in Utah. And so I learn a lot on those, and I find that pretty interesting talking to some of them. Not all of them, some of them. And I'm thinking about maybe I want to do interviews with more, like a broader group of people. And then I want to do more like history research shows like I did with Christopher Columbus. But it requires sitting down. Like the hardest part for me, I can read a bunch of stuff and intake it and then kind of spit it out. So back to preparation, if I'm doing the Chris Spangle show, let's take if I was going to do, what was the last one that we did? Shoot. I can't think of it. It's like right on the tip of my tongue. Oh, it's the Mike McCarthy. I keep saying Mike McCarthy. It's Kevin McCarthy. I know it's Kevin. It's not Mike. Kevin McCarthy. I've read several books about near Republican history, like The Right and Tim Alberta's book. So, I'm constantly reading books on a few different subjects. Like right now, I'm about to finish one on Shinzo Abe from Japan, the longest serving prime minister that got assassinated. It's like, well, why was this guy significant? So I've read a book on the politics of Japan since World War II. It's dry as dirt, but when it's like really important to kind of have an awareness of all these different things. I read a bunch of stuff on Ukraine and Russia. So there's sort of the book reading that I do, which is a couple hours a day, kind of keeps the floor raised a little bit, right? So you have the ability to make connections. I'll highlight the crap out of stuff, but like I'm not typically doing anything content-wise with that reading. And then every day I read the news in the morning as I'm kind of watching the Bob and Tom show, waiting for stuff to come through for me to do. That 8, 9 o'clock hours, I'm waiting for the show to end. I'm going through a bunch of different websites and kind of reading headlines, reading snippets of news. And so I have a general awareness of current events and what's going on. And then, of course, doom scrolling. And I find that kind of having the book knowledge where you're studying history and politics, you're reading that stuff, and then reading the news every day and, editorials, and then just kind of seeing what people are saying on social media about it kind of gives me a good understanding of a lot of different stories. And then if I'm going to do a subject, I'm going to go and read probably 20 different articles about Kevin McCarthy. And I'm going to read, I already have the knowledge from the books. I've kind of tracked what's gone on with the story, but I'm just going to go in and double check my facts and reread the stories and kind of take notes on who is Kevin McCarthy, what's his background, why is this story important, how did we get here, what are the risks, all the different vectors. And I've got a document that I don't really look at, but I've thought it out at least, and it's called a segment planner. And it's the who, what, why, where, and then it has, 40 different questions on it, probably 30, 40, 50 different questions to think about that particular story. That just to kind of think through. And I can share that in the show notes and put that up as a PDF, and you guys can download that segment planner and kind of take a look for yourself. And then I'll also listen to podcasts about it. I'll watch maybe a documentary or two about it in the week leading up to it. So when we do a show like the Kevin McCarthy show, or I've been doing Biden's documents, there's not really enough there that's sexy to do a show on it. But I may do like a monologue on it just so kind of people have an awareness of what's going on with the documents. Why is it different than Donald Trump's? What could possibly happen with the special prosecutor? All that stuff, right? I could probably do a monologue right now based on just the 4 hours of reading news articles and commentary on it from, Real Clear Politics and the left and the right and libertarians and Reason and all that, right? I could probably do a monologue on it, but I don't feel like I'm there yet. So I don't know. I feel like have a good handle on the Biden document story. I just don't feel like it's interesting. So I may do a story because I want to be of service to my listeners. So if they're confused, they don't have to do the 4 hours of reading, but I don't have an angle on it or something new to say about it. Like Biden had 10 documents. Trump had 300 documents or 400 documents. And neither of them should have had documents. And if then they were in the military, they would go to jail for 25 years per document. But they're not. They're elite, so they're not going to jail and suffer no consequences. And that's all there is to say about it, really. So it's sort of like a boring subject, even though it's the thing that people are talking about and kind of want to know about. So, but like the Kevin McCarthy story has like intrigue and players to it and drama, and people are really glued to it, right? Like, so that's what was always great about Trump, is there was always entertainment value to it. So you can do a show where you're kind of giving basic facts, but there's no drama to it, right? So it's just not interesting that Joe Biden someone accidentally packed 10 documents in a box and he didn't know about it, and that's it. It's stupid that he lied about it, but he's Joe Biden. He is George. He's George Santos without media accountability. So that's kind of how I prep for one of those shows. So like for HMP, for the Chris Spangle show, I'm constantly like kind of just consuming information, thinking. I have a good memory. I don't write a lot down for those kind of shows. I do a lot of highlighting in Readwise. So for news articles, I use Instapaper. I save it to Instapaper, and then I read in the Instapaper app and highlight it. Those highlights sync to Readwise, all one word. And then when I'm reading in my Kindle, or if I'm reading a physical book, I'll take a picture and scan in with OCR the actual quotes. So on any book that I read, I've probably got anywhere from 30 to 150 different highlights from that book that I can kind of go and skim if I'm going to talk about that in the future. And it's all in Readwise. Great service. So I don't know that I use it like as research a lot, but it's sort of insurance knowing that I don't have to go back and read that book, right? So that's the beauty of highlighting. Like this book that I checked out from the library, The Plot by Will Eisner, which is the basis of the Protocol show. I didn't highlight, I didn't take notes, and now I've got to kind of like read the book again to do the show. So it's sort of a big pain in the butt. For the biblical study show, or for the survey of St. Augustine history, or, those are going to be like research projects where you're sitting down, observing what's happening in the material, documenting the timelines, interpreting the information, making an application for your listeners. There's a fair bit of research that kind of goes into those shows, right? So like Matt, when he's sitting there reading, he's reading books like mad to get his general knowledge up for the history of modern politics. He's then using Wikipedia and other sources to kind of rewrite the timeline and the structure of it. And then he's making the applications. And we don't do a lot of application with that show because we just sort of feel like if you're listening to that, you're smart, you're going to see the parallels. We don't need to lead you to water. But for like Liberty Explained, the audience is, I'm a dumbass about libertarianism and I need you to lead me to water, right? So, you have to think about your audience sophistication. For podcasting and platforms, the podcasting show, it's people who don't know anything about it. And one of the struggles with that show is kind of like taking what is naturally rote for me at this point, that is muscle memory for me, and thinking about it like a beginner, and then trying to write that out in a show. For those shows, I've started kind of doing some bullet points. I am not nearly consistent enough with that show. That's one of my goals this year. It's like, if I'm going to do Liberty Explained, I'm going to do it. I got there with Chris Spangle show last year. I was very consistent last year. I'm going to have something in that feed once a week. My goal this year is 2 things in the feed every week: an interview or a monologue or a panel show. So Wednesdays would be an interview, and then Saturday would be the panel show or a monologue or a research show, right? So that's kind of how I'm thinking about this stuff. When do I get time to do all this stuff? Well, it's usually later in the day. So I wake up at 6. I start watching the Bob and Tom show. I take in the content. I answer emails for both personal and Bob and Tom stuff. Talk with my coworkers about what we want to poll to highlight that day. And then typically kind of my day there is done around 1 or 2. And then I've got time to do interviews through the afternoon, or I've got time to do some research, or maybe record something. So like today, went to work, had a meeting, came back, did all my Bob and Tom stuff. I was done around 3 with my day job, and then had an interview at 4 for the public affairs radio show. I haven't even talked about that. And then after that, recorded 5 episodes of Liberty Explained. Now I'm recording this. Tomorrow, in my free time, I'll process all that stuff and post it, or send it off to Lauren, who is my editor. And I use Lauren to edit audio and to do some basic tasks. Now, I don't do my personal podcast stuff every day. That's what I'm talking with you about today. The majority of my time is kind of spent on Bob and Tom and then client work. So I have several different clients that I edit podcasts for, or I do special services for them, or I have meetings with them and kind of do audits for them and consult with them. And that is like the tier. Like, I've got to keep Bob and Tom happy because that's my insurance and the foundation of my salary. And then we've got the consultant clients that I got to make sure that I get their work done and make sure they're happy. And then I have the Chris Spangle show, and We Are Libertarians, and that's got to be done because I make income off of that, and I've got patrons that I need to make sure that I'm serving. And then if I have time, I'll do podcasting and platforms or Liberty Explained or whatever, right? I'll do my own stuff. And then if I have time after that, and I want to see if I'm not spending time with my family, then I'll do like research stuff. Like tonight, I think it's like 7. What time is it? So it's 7:30. Squish is at her dad's tonight. My wife is downstairs reading. But I would say 3 nights a week, 2 nights a week, I am in my office just kind of like working till 10. So, the day starts at 6 and then the day ends at 10, and there isn't a lot of time where I'm not in the office working through that time, but I work from home, so I'm blessed to kind of get to see my daughter. She comes in, I talk to my wife through the day, so it doesn't feel like a long, hard work day, and I'm not neglecting them. Like, I'm present, and like we went to the doctor yesterday, the OBGYN, my wife is pregnant, and kind of, I got to do that. And like, to be honest, I didn't do a lot for 3 hours and then I had to kind of make up for it through the rest of the day, but I have a flexible schedule and I can kind of do that stuff. It's like, they don't care at the day job, or clients don't care, as long as you get their stuff done. Right. So if you're doing it at 8 p.m. or if you're doing it at 8 a.m., it doesn't matter as long as you're meeting deadlines. Right. So, I've got to make sure that I'm pulling stuff for Agile, one of my clients. I got to make sure that I'm posting every Wednesday the Urban Foundry podcast. I've got to make sure that I'm every Monday hitting the Leaders and Legends stuff. And I've got that all on my calendar. Right. So it really just comes down to like working hard. And I will say that the reason the We Are Libertarian stuff suffered so much over the last year especially is that I just didn't have the bandwidth. And I took that audience a little too for granted, and I do feel bad about that. It just kind of got to a point where my health got bad. I moved in with my wife and got married, added a child to my life, having a child in my life, moved after 8 years. So it kind of took me like 6 months to get my life in a position where I can work these long days and be productive, build a studio at Harry's house where we could do the show that we want to do for We Are Libertarians. But I like, my dream job is reading books and then talking about it. That's always been what I've always wanted to do. And at some point we will be debt free enough that I don't have to work at Bob and Tom anymore. And I don't know when that'll be, but we're doing great with consulting and with Bob and Tom, and able to kind of get prepared for this baby and live a nice, comfortable life, and fund We Are Libertarians and do all that kind of stuff. So I don't know, like, I'm at a point where I can do all these different research projects, but they come last. They're at the end of the day, the book on the history of St. Augustine comes last. So that's where I'm kind of having trouble, is like picking what I'm going to study in the free time that I have, and what am I going to work on. So like the Indiana history podcast, the St. Augustine history podcast, like those are like, put a pin in them podcasts. for the Indiana History podcast, the St. Augustine podcast, I'd love to try a storytelling podcast for those. But the reality is the Libertarian shows and the Pat Down pay money. They pay me. And the clients pay me. And Bob and Tom pays me. So, there's just only so many hours that you can have in a day and have a happy family life. And, you've only got a kid for 5 years before they go to school. Our other kids will be homeschooled, but, being from a split household, poor Squish has to go to public school. But, so we only have 5 years with her. So I don't want to be absent because I'm doing too many podcasts. So, but anyways, that's kind of my background with all this stuff. Kind of rambly, I get it. When I'm looking at my research list, for instance, of kind of what I want to achieve this year, I want to do a class about podcasting. I've got a client, the Indiana Historical Society has hired me to give them a 2-hour class on podcasting and then help them develop a podcast. Just a dream client for me. So excited about that. I was like so nervous pitching them. But they're like, I'm just really excited about that one. But I've got to write a 2-hour presentation on how to podcast. So, I've got to be diligent about writing that stuff. I want to at some point, I mentioned the history of St. Augustine. I mentioned the podcast on the Sermon on the Mount. I mentioned the Indiana History podcast. Those are kind of like going to take a long time, maybe a few years to do it. I'd also like to do a systematic look at libertarianism with Liberty Explained. I just kind of burned the episodes that I had written. But again, I didn't particularly like those. But like what I really like to achieve over the next year is really kind of taking a systematic look at these different areas of my life, putting together a system of podcasting, putting together a systematic look at libertarianism for people, putting together definitive statements about certain things. I think the Sermon on the Mount, for me personally, is an enormous guide. And I don't feel like I know it or understand it well enough, but it's, again, a system of kind of how to, of personal conduct, of how to approach your spiritual life, of how to approach other people, of how to approach yourself. And then I've got a couple speeches to give, so I've got to write a speech, and I don't know what to write about, but and kind of taking a long view on the history of Indiana and the history of St. Augustine and kind of slowly putting those bits and pieces together for those future podcasts. But man, what I love is just taking some time, taking an hour or two and just not knowing what time it is, not knowing what my schedule is, not knowing where anybody in my household is. And pure bliss is just concentrating on a thing you're writing and researching it, and then, performing that. And I don't think I nailed the Christopher Columbus one. I felt like it got sloppy in the second half, but that was so much fun to me, was writing the history of Columbus. And it took 6 months of reading and researching and kind of putting it together. But I've always had in the back of my mind, why does everybody hate Christopher Columbus? And then I went to Dominican Republic and I went to Puerto Rico, and I found out why everybody hates Christopher Columbus. So just kind of digging in there. And so I guess the fundamental shift, along with the confidence over the last few years for me, is that I'm doing podcasts more for stuff that I'm interested in and less to serve an audience because I think that's what the audience wants. And that's kind of why I think I have this struggle with finishing P&P and finishing Liberty Explained, is that Liberty Explained is clickbait because people want quick answers to those questions, and it's highly searchable, and it's driving people to the platform. But it's kind of soulless. and not as interesting to me as, maybe the history of the protocols of the Elders of Zion. But not many people are going to click on that one. They're going to click on, can you be a racist and libertarian? Right? So, all I did back in the day was think about what will get people to listen to this episode. And I was obsessed with it. And now I'm sort of like, I've got this time. What do I want to learn? And then share with my audience what I learned. I don't know that that's going to be successful. I've made some big mistakes, I think, with We Are Libertarians over the last couple of years. I think changing the name and changing the format and some of that stuff, it led to a lot of audience erosion, and it led to a lot of Patreon cancellations and not many signups. And I'll kind of talk about some of those mistakes in a future episode. But yeah, I mean, I don't know. I don't know what the right strategy, but the thing with my podcasting career, my personal podcasting career, is just experimenting, and trying. I have to do some things a certain way for Bob and Tom. I have to do what the client wants me to do within my experience when I'm guiding them, right? But, I have to do client work the way that the client wants and how it makes them happy, right? Now, they usually look at me and go, what do you think, right? So I have a lot of ability to influence, but at the end of the day, it's how they want it, right? So this is just my selfish me time. So I don't know what was accomplished here. I don't know if you got anything out of that. I don't know if anybody's going to listen to this. I kind of enjoyed talking through this stuff with you. I hope that you heard something you can use. You're paying money, so I want it to be usable for you. But I also kind of think you pay money because you want to hear what I think and all that good stuff, right? It's always the challenge. It's always the challenge when you're a podcaster, kind of deciding between the crass materialism and commercialism of clickbait and giving the people what they want and then giving them what they need. Or giving them what you find most interesting. Sometimes as a podcaster of almost 20 years, I sort of feel like a Led Zeppelin reunion tour. I know you just want to hear Black Dog and Stairway to Heaven, but I've really got this new sound that I've been working on, man, and I think you're going to love it. And you don't love it. You want to hear Black Dog. But I don't know. It's a fun experimentation for me to kind of think through these things and think where's the next phase of my podcasting career going? I think you could hear in the beginning of this, my passion for this as a medium is never going away. I could never not do podcasting. It's what I was born to do. It's what I was meant to do. The consulting and the day job and all that stuff. I enjoy doing that stuff. I like doing that stuff. I love the challenge of helping someone kind of figure out how to build their own little brand like I've built for myself and others. And it pays well, right? But, the time that takes away from my ability to read my books is a struggle, but so anyways, I'd love this to be a little interactive. I'd love you to get on, if you're a podcasting and platforms person, get on the PNP website, leave some comments. If you're a WAL patron, leave a comment on the post on the Patreon site, or you can send me an email at chris@chrisspangle.com. And we can chat that way. You email me and then I'll read it here and then we'll talk about it a little bit. So, but the focus of this is just kind of documenting what I'm doing, what I'm thinking every week, what equipment I'm using. Let me look at my calendar this week and just to give you an example. I talked a little bit about recording these episodes and what the point of it is. And, oh yeah, I do a public affairs radio show. So today I interviewed Don Wettrick, which I'm doing this public affairs show. I used to do it. It's called Now Hear This. Now I do it, and I put the episodes in the Chris Spangle Show. And then the on-air version is called We Thought You Might Like to Know, which is a legendary phrase here in Indianapolis. And the Indiana Association of School Broadcasters doesn't have public affairs content. So every week they're supposed to have every radio station has 30 minutes of public affairs content. And so you are legally obligated to have it. But if you're a high school or college, you have semesters and you don't have consistent staff. So the Association of School Broadcasters asked me to create this content. It's been kind of a struggle to find nonprofits and stuff that would be interesting to that core younger audience. It's been and then also do the interview in a way that is going to appeal to the Chris Spangle Show audience. I think I've done an okay job of kind of finding that medium. But what's funny is posting some local content, even if it has a global focus. So let's say right after the Dobbs decision, I did an episode on adoption because everybody's talking about how bad adoption was or how bad fostering was. So I went out and found some fostering charities and talked to them. And even though it was a local-based organization, the majority of the conversation was kind of interest, I think, to people who aren't in Indianapolis. But it's so funny how, like, they hear Indianapolis and they're just like, peace out, I'm out. Like, I'm not listening to this, or I'm dropping my Patreon because I don't have it. I don't know. So people half listen and they don't quite get your vision, even if they are your P1s who listen to every episode. But, you know, what I've tried to do with the Chris Spangle Show, in the absence of the ability to do the panel show, which the Chris Spangle Show, formerly We Are Libertarians, used to just be friends sitting around talking about politics. But then we kind of ran out of friends, and Harry and I, basically with a 3-year-old and a 4-year-old, now a 4 and a 5-year-old, just find it really hard to meet every Saturday to do it. So we're meeting a couple times a month to do the panel show with our friends in person. It's very important to me to get back to in person. But there was a long stretch where I couldn't do that. So I started adding the public affairs content and working with young voices to kind of do, 20-minute interviews on subjects that are not really covered in the news. Because one thing that I really want to do with the Chris Spangle Show is not just talk about what you're talking about, but kind of with these young voices folks covering topics. I probably do 40% of the guests that are pitched to me by them. And I try to pick the guest and topics that I think are kind of uncovered. So, my dad's calling, so I just got distracted. But, so today I was talking to Don Wettrick, who runs an organization called Started Up Foundation, which teaches high school students entrepreneurship and kind of is a Shark Tank. It's like a small business incubator for high school students, and it's really cool. And the episode was about the importance of entrepreneurship as a value. Not explicitly, but that was the point of why I wanted to do that episode, right? So every episode that I do, I have some thought into what am I kind of trying to advance here? And I think I need to be more systemic with it and kind of maybe write a book for myself or for my listeners of like, here's my view, like on politics, and here's what I think is, but I'm kind of like figuring some of that stuff out because I'm not an anarchist. I never have been. So what's the, a lot of what you hear on the Chris Spangle Show now is not just crass commercialism, clickbait on current events. It's me trying to kind of figure out what I think and what I believe, and I'm going to even kind of be more open with that. But today, I talked to Don Wettrick about that. And then tomorrow I've got 2 interviews. I've got one with Jack Salmon about Social Security and Reformation ideas, and then I'm talking to Hawk about COVID stuff. Interviewed him previously. He's done a documentary on COVID lockdowns. And then Saturday, We Are Libertarians, and then we're talking about gun stuff. And then Monday I have a client. I'm recording client stuff on Monday and Tuesday. And then do I have an interview? Yeah, I have an interview Wednesday afternoon. I've got a meeting on Thursday of next week with a potential podcast for the network. So yeah, I mean, there's just always some little thing that I'm working on that I'd like to kind of bring you into what I'm doing so you can hear it. And maybe if you hear something, you can write in and say, you mentioned this and I wanted to hear more about that. And then you moved on because you're ADHD, right? So I want this to be a two-way conversation, and if you've made it this far in it, then you're definitely going to be interested in the conversation. So I'd love to hear kind of like, as you hear me kind of work this stuff out and where I'm at and what I'm thinking in my podcast stuff, I think it's a way to kind of hold me a little bit of accountable and also, kind of give you some idea sparkers on things. So feel free to write in. It's a two-way conversation. Thank you so much for listening to this bonus episode. I truly appreciate you guys, and I'll see you again next week.